gentlemen, distinguished audience, it's difficult for me to specify exactly who is a minister, who is an excellency, a general, a scholar. So I welcome all of you attending our panel today. I would say it's one of the weighty intellectual panels of this forum, with Charles Powell from Elcano, who is one of the co-hosts of this event. I would say we are veterans of this format. Last year, we had another panel dedicated to the future of Europe from another angle, strategic autonomy in the next decade, reality or utopia. Now, this year, we have another challenging subject dedicated to the parliamentary elections, which are to take place very soon, and how will Europe look like in 4 years' time. I would suggest to put some, as the French say, jalons, to establish to encompass the discussion. Last year, so we were between strategic autonomy on one side and 1 year's Zeitenwende. We had behind us the Munich Security Conference, starting with Westlessness, beyond Westlessness, and now this year we had lose-lose. So at least only from these titles, I think we can guess that even if we don't have in front of us a blissful vision, at least we have a much more clear vision of the cartography of the abyss, the shades between light and darkness. I will refer now to President Macron's speech in the Sorbonne. He had 3 basic points: the military and geopolitical security risks, the economical and technological challenges, and third, the crisis of democracy. I think the question of democracy is the core, or one of the cores of the discussion, and I will refer here to yesterday's panel with the President of the Romanian Senate and Speaker of the Moldovan Parliament, when Ambassador Nihnea Motok inquired, let's say rhetorically, why should we discuss about elections and democracy in the context of hard security, which is the subject matter of this forum? Well, it is essential to discuss about that, because these are the stakes. So, with your permission, Charles, I will hand you over the floor. Roughly about 8 minutes each, and then I will encourage interactive discussions between you and naturally questions and answers. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, dear Georg. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm the director of the Real Instituto Elcano Royal Institute, which is Spain's leading international relations think tank based in Madrid. We have an annual budget of about 6 million euros, 60 staff, and a small office in Brussels, and we're hoping to set up a small office in Washington next year. Following from your early remarks, Georg, and Macron's speech, he talked about the geopolitical dimension, the geoeconomic dimension, and democracy. And since my esteemed colleagues are far more experienced in dealing with the hard security issues than I am, I want to concentrate on the other two, on the economy and on democracy. Having said this, though, it's obviously very important, I think, to underline in a panel about the European Union that the EU's major foreign policy goal should be Ukraine's victory in this war against Russia. If Ukraine loses the war, this will be the end of a lot of important things, and I think the whole process of European integration would be very seriously undermined. Now, the emphasis on economics, I think, is important because the EU, during the next institutional cycle, will continue to try to face and will continue to try to finance a whole plethora of policy areas. And, of course, defense expenditure will increase. If I'm not mistaken, current EU defense expenditure is approximately 220 billion US dollars. And my colleagues perhaps will like to explore why we get so little bang for our buck, and I think this will be one of the big challenges in the next institutional cycle. But more importantly, from the point of view of the issue that I want to address, is that Europe is basically falling behind, right? We represent 10% of the world's population, 15% of the world's GDP. We are not very innovative, we are not very competitive, we are falling behind very seriously in the technological arena. So to my mind, the first question that those responsible for EU institutions, and of course member states above all, in the next institutional cycle have to face is, how are we going to become more innovative? And Enrico Letta, in his recent report, which probably hasn't been mentioned in this conference so far, so let me do so very briefly, has come up with some very obvious but very important ideas. Letta's argument is very simple. What is the strongest thing we have in the EU? What is the cornerstone of the EU? It's basically the single market, which dates back to the 1980s and the Jacques Delors period. And as Letta's report points out, the single market is fine, it's our strongest asset. By the way, it's what gives us most leverage as a global actor. But it's incomplete in three crucial areas: energy, banking, financial services, and telecoms. Those three areas, which are totally, absolutely crucial for the future of the European economy, are simply not part of the internal market. And I won't go into the proposals that he suggested, but basically what I'm arguing is that unless we become more competitive, unless we grow more, unless we hold our own, particularly in the technological arena, we will be running into serious trouble. The second point is about democracy. As you just pointed out, Georg, obviously, without a significant buy-in from our societies, the European project will be significantly hampered. We have European elections coming up in a couple of weeks, next month. I think some people are perhaps exaggerating the danger of a far-right success in many member states and the consequences that this might have for the next European Parliament. But it's pretty clear to me, though, that there are two areas where there is significant pushback. If you look at what the EU is trying to do, we basically have two systemic goals right now. One is the green transition, the other is the digital transition. And a lot of our citizens are beginning to have doubts about both, about the viability and the impact of both. A lot of our citizens are beginning to realize that the green transition will have winners and losers. And I think European authorities and perhaps European politicians generally are not being entirely transparent and sincere about that. And as far as the digital transition is concerned, obviously that generates less pushback. But again, this is a question of winners and losers. This will not benefit everyone equally. And again, I think that the EU narrative is not entirely transparent or forthright about this. So my point about democracy is quite simple. When we talk about democracy, we talk about input democracy and output democracy. Input democracy is guaranteed by elections. The June elections, of course, will be free and fair everywhere in Europe. But the EU's ability to produce outputs, which a majority of our citizens can relate to and can buy into, is, I think, in doubt at the moment. One final topic I want to mention is enlargement. This is a Black Sea and Balkans forum, and I don't think we've actually talked about Western Balkan enlargement in the entire forum. And I think this is important because ultimately enlargement is our most powerful geostrategic tool as far as the EU is concerned. And my point here is quite simply this. We need to do much more during the next financial and institutional cycle to promote the convergence of candidate states with the rest of the European Union. We are making perfectly logical demands on candidate countries, but we are still doing very little to assist them in achieving convergence, both economic and, of course, also political. And as we've seen with other member states, this can cause serious disruption once membership is achieved. And I'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, and I'm grateful not only for your first 2 points, but for mentioning enlargement. Actually, it's one of foreign policy priority for Romania. And yesterday it was mentioned that we are between the Black Sea and the Balkans. I have in front of me Jordan Bojilov, who made this point yesterday, during yesterday's panel on precisely the Western Balkans, and I'm very happy you highlighted it, because the question of elections has also an impact on EU's external action. Commissioner Orban, you are, I think, a veteran of Romania's integration in the European Union. And today you, fortunately, I would say, joined our club in the New Strategy Center. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maghiero. I will try to be very complementary with your intervention and to refer to different aspects. But first of all, a few words about elections. There will be not only European elections, so the elections for the European Parliament, but there will be also elections in 9 member states. So 2024 is a very, very important year from this point of view. Looking at the recent polls concerning the European elections, it is very clear that there will be a shift to the right. So the anti-European and populist party are likely to win the election in at least 6 member states: Austria, Belgium, France, Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands. So 4 out of 6 founding members of the EU. And come second and third in many other member states. So it is very clear that right-wing and the extreme right-wing parties will win votes and seats, while the left and Greens will lose votes and seats. This is clearly, I don't think that there will be a major change compared with the situation of today. This, no doubt, there will have influences on how the decision-making process will evolve at the European level. No doubt, some policies will be re-examined, and because Mr. Power talked about Green Deal, about environmental transformation. It's no doubt that Green Deal will be affected, especially the implementation of different pieces of legislation will be significantly affected. Then another significant change concerning the policies of the EU will be related with migration. We have finally a package, asylum and migration adopted by the European institution. I'm afraid that this will be considered as being insufficient for the many member states, and further measures will be proposed and most likely adopted by the European Union, aiming at tightening and making migration more and more difficult. There will be also other changes. There will be other discussions about, for example, strategic autonomy of the Union. No doubt there will be attempts to do more and more and more in order to increase the strategic autonomy of the Union, with one exception, concerning security. Here on security and defense and security, no doubt there will be many discussions. Because looking, for example, at what President Macron said in his speech, in his second speech in Sorbonne, there is a clear vision of European defense and security on the European continent, with significant less involvement of the Americans. I'm afraid that the countries, the EU member states from Central and Eastern Europe and from the northern part of Europe will be very reluctant to see such kind of developments without significant involvement of United States here on this topic. Of course, nobody knows what will happen if Trump will be re-elected. But however, let's say the current opinion is very strong that it's the United States involvement on the security on the European continent is vital. It would be very difficult to replace the Americans. Let's be very clear. From many reasons. And one reason, it was mentioned before, it's the money. It's the money, not only the money allocated to the EU budget, but it is also the money, let's say, every member state is willing to spend on defense and security. And to be very clear on this, by far the most important, the most problematic issue for the Union is Russia. A win, and I fully agree with you, that if Russia wins in Ukraine, we can no longer talk about security, a real security in Europe. We will be confronted with very dramatic developments. And it's very clear we have to do everything possible in order to support Ukraine. I would like also to say also a few words about China. Finally, Europe realized that interdependencies could be very dangerous in some areas. And fortunately, the Commission, but also the member states, had started the so-called de-risk process, diminishing significantly the interdependencies mainly on China. And there are three signals indicated that Europe's de-risking is progressing. Western businesses are pulling out billions of profits from China instead of investing them back in the Chinese market. China is increasingly directing its own trade away from Western markets, and foreign direct investment outflows surpass inflows to China for the first time. These are positive developments, but however, we have to recognize that the level of the risk from the point of view of different member states is very different. There are countries, like France, for example, who is really be very ambitious in this progress. There are others, like Germany, where despite the recent progress, many will have to be done from this point of view. So I'm optimistic that we finally realize that it's a major risk and we will have to do significantly more from this point of view. I will conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this panoramic view you have presented, which is very useful to complete our discussion. Monsieur Hesbour, last year you were here on my left side. Centre pour la Recherche Stratégique, another partner of the new strategy, another strategic partner of the new strategy center. Very happy to have you again in Bucharest. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. In the title of this session, we have the sentence, "What will the EU look like in 4 years?" I think that's actually a brilliant way of putting things. It's going to look very different from what it has been for the previous 70 and some years. Until the beginning of this decade, the EU, the European integration process, was shaped by 2 wars, the outcome of World War II and the Cold War. And we had a high degree of strategic as well as practical congruence between what was essential from the strategic standpoint, that is, the centrality of the European theater, and the nature of Europe's integration process, the EU and NATO together. This looked very neat, and in many ways actually was very neat. This is already no longer the case, and we're going to see this unfold over literally the next 4 years and beyond. The EU will be, first of all, be shaped, of course, by another war, the war in Ukraine, and its outcome. What we do know about this war at this stage is that it's a long war. It has already lasted 28 months. This is not a short war. Could it end quickly? Quite possible. But if it did, it will probably mean a Russian victory. I don't see a quick Ukrainian victory. I want a Ukrainian victory, but I also know that that is not going to happen quickly. So I assume this is the best case analysis, not the worst case analysis, that it will be a very long war. And that means that however much the EU may want to get back to its usual economic knitting, if I can put it that way, it will not be able to do so because Ukraine will be a theater of war, not a place for investment and reconstruction. Second point, the United States is being more and more focused on the Indo-Pacific theater. You don't need to be Elridge Colby or to believe what Elridge Colby says to understand that over the next decades, the US will have to focus much more its strategic efforts on what is the pivotal area of the world, and that is the Indo-Pacific theater. And to do so with what are actually quite limited means. The United States spends on its defense this year, on the basis of high economic growth in the US in 2024, the US is spending 3.2% of its GDP on defense. As a world power, as a superpower, 3.2%. Somewhat less than Poland, just about the same as Estonia, and maybe just a sliver bit more than Greece. What is wrong in this picture? Well, I don't know whether there's anything wrong in this picture, but what it tells me is that there is not much oxygen in the American system, even if we have a non-Trump presidency, to devote to theaters other than Indo-Pac over the next 10 years. So the congruence, the strategic and political congruence that we have had between the EU and NATO, between the transatlantic relationship and European integration, this congruence is going to give place to a much more disjointed picture, where the primary theater is not going to be in Europe. And that also means that it's not simply, and I completely agree with what has just been said about de-risking and so on, and the Europeans are beginning to do the right sort of things vis-à-vis China, but the fact is that we're also, as the EU, going to have to handle a triangular relationship, which is always very complicated, between the US, China, and ourselves. A three-body problem, as the physicists would put it, And anybody who reads science fiction, the famous novel, the Chinese novel called The Three-Body Problem, knows how complicated that can be. And whether the EU has today set up the right institutions and put the right effort into the handling of this three-body problem, which is heavily economic and technological, I would add, is one of the big problems we're going to have to face during the next 4 or 5 years. What is this new European Union going to look like? It is going to be, it will be much more military, if only because the EU is the only level at which we can secure economies of scale. The EU, as I speak, is producing through its member states and the industry, but under the aegis of the Commission, is producing as many pieces of ammunition as the United States is. Now, is it easy to replace the US? No, it isn't. But the EU represents half of the defense effort made by the West for Ukraine. Half by the US, half by the EU. If somebody had told me 2.5 years ago, if there is a war, the EU will actually be putting in half of the effort, I would have said, that's going to be bloody difficult. Well, it has been difficult, but it's actually happening. So it will be a more military EU, first thing. Secondly, NATO will be more European. It will have to be. And this independently of whether it's Trump, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, or whoever, the US is simply not going to be able to focus as much as it has had on its commitments in Europe. So we're going to have to start thinking about a subtle, I'll use polite words, a greater degree of political and strategic European leadership in NATO than has been the case until now. I won't talk about the takeover bid. That would not be polite and probably wildly premature. 2 parameters in closing, which will determine how this 4-year process is going to unfold. The first is a parameter which I think is not going to change, and that is the permanency of the French-German relationship. For better or for worse, we know that in the EU, nothing can happen if the French and the Germans disagree. If the French and the Germans agree, then things may happen. It's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. But it means that if this European Union of the future is going to exist and prosper, there'll have to continue to be some degree of French-German compromise. And then the last parameter, of course, is Russia. It has been mentioned. Russia is testing and probing, even before large-scale military operations in Ukraine have been ratcheted down as an effect of Russian victory in Ukraine. You saw what happened on the Narva River yesterday. You saw what happened with the Russian probe on the maritime borders of Finland. Finland pushed back quickly and convincingly. So all of a sudden you no longer find Russian drivel about redefining those borders on the Russian Ministry of Defense website this morning. So all probes do not lead to Russian success. But the Russians probe everywhere and all the time now. They have a military group of ships going through the Grand Belt Straits this morning, having switched off all of the identification systems, AIS as it's called in the naval arena. 8 ships. And the Danes are looking at this, and the Swedes are looking at this, the Norwegians are looking at this. A probe, a test. What will we do? What will we want to do? And as I speak, the Russians continue to interfere with GPS in about 1/3 of the Baltic space. This is just an avant-goût of what we're going to have to face if Russia continues to succeed in preventing Ukraine from delivering militarily meaningful counterattacks against Russia. And that is the description of the military situation today. Ukraine is resisting, but Ukraine is not today in a position to fight back. And that is under a Biden presidency. That's not under a Trump presidency. So there we are, more military, less American, more costly, because 3% will become the new 2%, not because Trump will force the money out of us, but because Putin will force the money out of us. That's the reality. And I rest my case here.
Monsieur Hezbour, in the beginning I mentioned that we are in a cartographic exercise of the abyss. I think we have gone deeper into the Dantesque, how to say, configuration or architecture of the circles from the core inner going to the enlargement, which is the extended family, going to the external interactions. And then we have an interesting, because you mentioned the French-German, how to say, founding couple of the Union. I think we have an interesting angle, a different angle from Mr. Carsten Ovens, which makes the binder between the internal and the external dimension of the European Union. Mr. Ovens, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And well, I couldn't agree more with most of what my esteemed panelist colleagues here have said so far, in particular what my French neighbor said. So that is good, because that means when Germany, I'm German, and French agree, we already have a good fundament for progress. So the European Leadership Network, the organization I represent, is a think tank that is dedicated to foster Europe-Israel relations. So that is the focus we have. And why it's important, I'd like to draw your attention to in just a couple of minutes, is based on, well, the insights are based on a study that we are going to publish early next month, where we interviewed together with the Royal Elcano Institute and the New Strategy Center more than 370 members of different European parliaments. In total, more than 30 European countries that participated in this study. So you can, by the numbers, already see it's not representative, but it's an interesting indication what European politics actually think about the current relations between Europe and the Middle East. And the ambassador said at the beginning that the Munich Security Conference focused on lose-lose, and I think based on these numbers it's better and very fair to speak about a win-win situation that is possible, and I think that is also a very positive call for this whole conference. So yes, Europe needs strong partners, and yes, the United States, as we also learned yesterday on one of the panels here in this room, will probably remain a very, very important and one of the strongest partners. And as Mr. Orban already said here, it's hard to replace, but we shall not only rely on the United States, so we need other partners. And this is what we found in our study. Not only that 3/4 of European parliamentarians believe that their individual bilateral relations with Israel are good or rather good, it's also that more than 70 members of European parliaments that participated in our study say they want to increase the cooperation with Israel, which is interesting these days, not speaking for a minute about the war that is ongoing there in Gaza, but looking at what some European governments unilaterally try to push for now, which is a one-sided recognition of a Palestinian state, which is against the Oslo Accords, by the way. But nonetheless, some governments are pushing for this, so and this already shows a challenge Europe has, coming back to the core question of how will Europe look like in 4 years. France and Germany are two countries that should, best case, agree on most of the reforms that are necessary. But it's not only about Germany and France. We need a common foreign policy, which most of the time actually has a challenge of a French veto. But we need a common foreign policy, in particular in our direct neighborhood, when it comes to Ukraine, but also when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. And looking at the potentials, also European members of parliament believe in why they want to increase the collaboration with Israel. It's about technology, it's about science, and it's about defense. And you probably followed the discussions about the European Sky Shield initiative, more and more European countries joining. At one point we will also have our French friends joining this initiative, I'm positive. So it's Israeli technology with the Arrow 3 system that will protect in the future European citizens against potential aggressions from the East, speaking about Russia and speaking about Iran. And so this is just one very prominent example where a stronger collaboration leads to a win-win situation. It was the biggest defense deal in Israeli history, but it was also, or will also be a core pillar for our defense capabilities against potential aggressions. Another thing European MPs, for very good reasons, are interested in, speaking about peace and stability in the Middle East, are the Abraham Accords. So this is actually something most European countries tend to agree on and have a common position, which is, again, a good fundament for progress. And 85% of those MPs who participated in our European-wide studies say, yes, their countries and the European Union as a whole should further promote the agreements between Israel and more Arab countries. Because as we already saw in April during the recent Iranian aggression against Israel, it was also not only the United States, France and the UK that actually protected the only democracy in the Middle East, but it was also Arab countries that stepped up and protected Israel against the Iranian missile attacks. So having said that, and quoting President von der Leyen, who recently addressed this elephant in the room that most European countries for many years were rather reluctant to focus on, Iran has no interest whatsoever in this region, speaking about the Middle East, but actually also about Eastern Europe, coming to peace. On the contrary, Iran wants to foment violence and chaos because that secures its influence. And when we see these days that Ukrainian drones are used by the Russian regime to kill European citizens in Ukraine, we see that Iran is not only a challenge for the Middle East, but a very, very concerning challenge also for us here in Europe. So speaking about security, we also surveyed what members of the various European parliaments actually perceive as the biggest threat for their very own security, for their very own country. And yes, 69% of European MPs identify Russia as the most significant threat, but it's already followed by Iran with almost 20% and then China with 9%. So these are the three biggest threats European members of parliament see and ask their governments to act upon. So this is good. This gives us hope on the one hand. This gives us also calls to action, for example, to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization across the EU, which is definitely something we need to discuss after the European elections. And last but not least, it also gives us, the survey itself gives us new insights and, from my very own judgment, also positive signs and hope for further intensifying the collaboration among Europe in the area of defense. Speaking about NATO, 68% of European members of parliament from all the countries we surveyed favor closer collaboration between NATO and Israel on the one hand, and they also favor an enhancement of the EU integration of our individual armies. And speaking about getting more bang for the buck, as Charles Powell said at the beginning, yes, indeed, a further integration of our defense capabilities, probably as President von der Leyen suggested, introducing the position of a defense commissioner in Brussels, and maybe one day even leading not only to joint military operations and trainings, but indeed to a joint European army. That might be something to actually work on in the next 4 years in Europe. And this is also what our survey shows. European members of parliament are open for these ideas. We just have to bring this from the parliaments into the governments. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rovens. I think you have completed this panel with a concrete case study, so to say, indicating the complexity of the decision-making process in the European Union. Especially when you have to deal with strategic issues and with such a complex issue as the relation between European Union member states and the State of Israel. some of us having had very long-dated relations with what is today Israel. With this, I am happy to notice that we have time for Q&A and discussions. I would suggest first, as moderator, that you enhance between you what you think is to highlight between your own interventions, so as to facilitate to the audience to have a better view on where they want to target their interest. Charles?
Thank you. If I can build on what Francois was saying, so he basically, to summarize his points, the EU in the next 4 years will be more military, more defense-oriented, less American, in other words, more strategically autonomous. But I was wondering, will we be more united? I always like to remind everyone that the EU's motto is united in diversity. And I'm wondering whether, as a result of the war in Ukraine, we can actually now say that we are united in adversity. I'm not entirely sure that the war in Ukraine has actually brought the 27 member states closer together. The EU, during the next 4 years, I think will be increasingly heterogeneous. I totally agree with what's been said about the Franco-German tandem, necessary but not sufficient. And I think Romania and countries in this part of Europe have a very important role to play. In Spain, for example, we've been exploring what some people, some analysts have described as rather unlikely partnerships. For example, President Sanchez's very close relationship with Mark Rutte of the Netherlands, and the non-paper on strategic autonomy and the non-paper on economic governance, which this unlikely partnership has given rise to. This, by the way, is very much a consequence of Brexit. Nobody has mentioned Brexit so far, so let me inaugurate this. The Dutch, as you know, were traditionally very close to the UK, and once the UK very rashly left the European Union, the Dutch began to look around for new strategic partners. Obviously, they work very closely with France and Germany, but Spain and the Netherlands are the fourth and fifth largest economies in the EU, so this is actually quite an interesting partnership. And I'm hoping that in the next 4 years we will see more of these apparently unlikely partnerships emerging. Second point about Trump, which obviously Trump and the November elections are very much on our minds. I think the key thing here is, apart from hoping for the best and preparing for the worst, I think the EU basically has to get on with putting its own house in order, regardless of what's happening in the United States, conceptually and also in material terms. Going back to the point about diversity, I think in the next 4 years we will also see a stronger Commission. A stronger Commission, I think, is fundamental to counterbalance the centrifugal tendencies that are very strong in a large 27-member state union. I think we've already seen this under President von der Leyen. I have no idea whether she will continue to be president after the elections. Perhaps that wouldn't be a bad thing. I think she's been quite a good president overall. And obviously her focus on the geopolitical dimension of the Commission would probably acquire even greater salience. And just finally, one point about migration, and I'm very happy that you brought that up. The EU adopted this migration and asylum plan in April last month, and already 15 member states have signed a letter in which they basically say, we don't like the plan that we have just approved. And I stress this because if our biggest internal enemy is populism, there is nothing like migration to incite and generate populism. I think migration is the single most important cause of this wave of populism that we have to deal with in many European countries. So dealing with migration much more effectively than we have done, I think should continue to be the key, one of the key European goals of during the next institutional cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Orban.
Yeah, I would like to say a few words, firstly about the decision-making process in the European Union after the elections. You said, Mr. Powell, that you are not sure that President Ursula von der Leyen will be once again President of the European Commission. I think it's likely, but it could be a very complicated and a difficult process. Because if we are looking today at the figures, it seems that she does not have majority in the European Parliament. And we saw the socialist group saying that they will disagree with Ursula von der Leyen, the same Renew. So it seems that today, even that she, as she said, she will cooperate with the European conservators and reformists, she has not sufficient votes to be elected. This will create a real crisis at the European level if this will happen, because it's likely that the European Council would nominate Ursula von der Leyen for a new mandate, because it seems that the EPP will win clearly the elections, and I don't think that EPP will give up to the right to nominate a person from the group. Then the Parliament will refuse. What will happen? It's very difficult to say, and this is clearly a signal that also on many other files a similar situation could happen. We all know that the Parliament functions to a variable geometry, so every file, it's let's say, it's not very clear who is in favor, who is against, and so on and so on. This will continue to be like this, but however, it will be the more and more difficult to, let's say, to find majority in order to have the approval of different proposals. So it would be more complicated. And a few words about what will happen with the Union in the 4 years. I really don't know. Nobody can predict the future, okay? We can build scenarios and we can say something, but sometimes the future is so unpredictable, so it's clearly impossible to predict what will happen. I have just one question. What will happen if Madame Le Pen will win the elections, the presidential elections in France? What will happen with the cooperation, German-French cooperation? What will happen with, let's say, with the evolution of the Union? It's just one example. But there are many examples, so I don't rush with some ideas how the Union will look like. What I can say is that it's very important every day, every moment, the pro-European forces to be united, trying to push for the consolidation, for the unity of the Union. Because my strongest fear is that what will happen with the unity of Europe in the future. There will be many subjects to many, let's say, topics where there will be very, very complicated to have unanimity on these topics. Enlargement, you mentioned enlargement. My personal opinion today is that looking at the Western Balkans, there is not a real serious candidate for an accession within a period of time of 5 to 7 years. It's really what we see is, so the Union is blamed that we are not doing enough to support the countries to make the necessary progress in order to be able to accede to the Union. But looking at the developments in different countries, the situation is really dramatic. Serbia clearly gives us everyday signals that they do not share the same values with us. We appreciate very much what happened with Prespa agreement between Greece and North Macedonia. Now what we see in Skopje, we see that the president of the country, the new president, newly elected president of the country, is not longer using the name North Macedonia, but it's using just the word Macedonia. The same, the prime minister. What will happen with this? Do you think that Greece will accept any such kind of regress from this point of view? It happened also in the past. Greece refused any step forward of North Macedonia because of lack of agreement with the authority from the country. And the same, what is happening with Bosnia-Herzegovina, what is happening with Kosovo, what is happening with Albania. Albania, it's a solid candidate for accession, but however, the recent dispute between Albania and Greece, it's really very problematic. So there will be many subjects of division within the Union, and this is the main problem, I think, for the future.
You really know your file, the European file, intimately. Monsieur Hezbour.
Yeah, one can't predict the future. You're obviously right. And it's the old Prussian General Moltke, the elder, the successful one, in the middle of the 19th century said that the best plans do not resist the first contact with the enemy. That's true. But he added that that doesn't mean that you should not be planning. You obviously want to plan for a future that you consider as desirable, and in order to do that, you take into account those factors of which we have some knowledge. And I enunciated some of those trends a few minutes ago. We cannot afford to simply say we cannot predict the future, therefore we will have to look at in what in French we call le scénario du chien crevé au fil de l'eau, the scenario of the dead dog floating in the water. That is not a policy, although for some countries it may be a policy, but it's not one which recommends itself. And in the case of the US, I mean, I actually disagree in a practical sense, not in terms of principles, with the notion that rather than planning for the possible advent of a return of Trump, that we should put our house in order. The problem is that we had a house which was beautifully organized until very recently, particularly from the German standpoint, which was cheap Russian energy, excellent access to the Chinese market, and cheap American protection. That order is dead. The Zeitenwende is there. That's what Scholz was describing 2 years ago. And I disagree with the policy of Scholz, but the diagnosis was impeccable. And therefore, we should plan for the return of Trump. He may not be re-elected, but we'll be able to deal with his non-re-election. That's comparatively easier than to deal with his election. So it's basically, there is no downside to planning for Trump's election. And that is what we should be aiming for. On the European front, I obviously don't know what will happen in the Commission, the Parliament, and so on. What I do note is that many of the hard-right parties are swinging towards a situation in which they take ownership of the EU rather than wanting to leave it. And that's a big change. It obviously took a Brit to mention Brexit. None of us are eager to mention Brexit. But since it has been put on the table, one of the effects of Brexit is that it has cured the European hard right from wanting to do anything similar. And hard right takeover of European institutions is actually something rather more difficult to deal with than what used to be called Polexit or Frexit, what was it called in the Netherlands, Holexit. Those are off the table. And we have to organize also our own thinking around the possibility that the Italian hard right model will generalize in Europe. I understand that this is actually something which is it's also visible in Romania. That the old style exit from the EU is no longer there. And this leads already to a change in the zeitgeist. And strangely enough, because he's obviously not from the hard right, I think it was first enunciated by Macron in 2017 during the campaign, first campaign, when he talked about l'Europe qui protège. L'Europe qui protège is one of those few slogans which can actually unite people from the two ends of the European spectrum. Protection against unmastered migration. Protection, to take a much more contemporaneous item, protection in the economic and trade sphere. Now, I'm not a protectionist. I think that Europe is much better served by economic and commercial liberalism than the opposite. But the fact is that the United States under Biden, not to mention Trump, has adopted the mercantilist model. The United States is no longer a free trade country. The United States continues to destroy the World Trade Organization under Biden, not under Trump, not yet under Trump. And the United States has a policy of a combination of massive subsidies in areas of strategic importance for the Europeans, like the Chinese do. All of this being leavened by security implications. That is, China and the US are in opposition with each other, but they are in deep agreement with the notion that trade is a strategic item with security implications. The Europeans are not there yet, but that is where they will be moving during the next 4 years as well, if we're not very careful. And the hard right will obviously help push us in that direction. So that is something which we also have to take into account. Last point. The Commission has already become more powerful through the pandemic, success, and through the arms production involvement of the Commission since the large-scale invasion of Ukraine. The question then becomes whether this new power will increase further or whether it will be ratcheted back. And I don't know what the answer to that is. A lot will depend on what happens or doesn't happen to Mrs. van der Leyen. But we already have to take into account that it's no longer a prognosis, it's a diagnosis. The Commission is more powerful.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roberts, I would like to have you briefly, because I know I sacrificed from the Q&A, but I think everybody wanted to listen to you.
I keep it short, but just some points to react also was my fellow panelists here said. So I think it's fair to summarize that external shocks over the past couple of years on several levels have brought Europe, at least on some points, closer together. So it was, on the one hand, COVID. Yes, I agree. Even though we miserably failed, we means the European member states and the European Union as itself, miserably failed in the first couple of months in the beginning of 2020 due to a lack of digitalization, a lack of organization. So China clapped its hands as they could deliver some masks to Italy, while Germany, France, and other large European countries were just completely unable and dysfunctional to provide what was needed in Italy these days. So, but nonetheless, Europe learned, so the Commission came out stronger. Same with the war of Russia against Ukraine. So Putin at the very beginning thought Europe and NATO are weak, so that's why he attacked. And the outcome is that still he failed in conquering larger parts of Ukraine for an immense loss on both sides. And we have 2 new NATO members that joined because they feel threatened. And not only that, we have now German soldiers on Baltic soil being welcomed and invited by the countries up there because they ask for protection from a country that brought war over that over those people. So also this, I think, is a sign that external shocks are sometimes unfortunately necessary to push for progress. So that is what Europe needs, indeed, more reforms, less French veto. So speaking about the EU Commission President, yes, Ursula von der Leyen is, from my point of view, not only because she's German, but she is probably the strongest commissioner we ever had, at least over the past decades. And, but she can only be as strong as the French allow her to be. So while we are in the midst of the election campaign at the moment throughout Europe, and we have a grand character there who is the president, we have the French government already suggesting other people. And we need to remind ourselves that von der Leyen became president because of France, because Macron actually wanted to prevent Manfred Weber, who was the EPP candidate to become the Commission president. He just wanted to prevent him, so that's how Angela Merkel then came up with a clue and could implement Ursula von der Leyen, who turned out to be really a win for Europe. So to summarize, I think here, and then I'll leave it to our dear moderator for the Q&A with the audience, what we need more from Europe to prevent populism is indeed protection. We need to give people back the feeling that they are protected, no matter if it's about climate change, if it's about migration, if it's about threats from Russia or Iran, and that is where so far many European member states fail. That is why we see more and more populism, even though I agree that the populists in Italy, the populists, right-wing populists in the Netherlands, and very likely also in France will become a bit more moderate, will try to change the system from within, and we already see it looking at how Le Pen reacts vis-à-vis the German radical AfD, that they, together with their fellow Italians, now kicked them out of the parliamentary group. This is very important, not only to weaken the AfD in Germany, but actually to give signals to more moderate parties that they will actually leave the radicals out of this. But nonetheless, we need to get back to a feeling of protection.
Thank you so much. I know the audience will be angry with me, but I wanted to let you speak your minds. From across the Atlantic, I think in front of you. Sure. You have a big one. Pick yours.
No, thanks. A question for Francois and anybody else wants to answer. I mean, I think your broad point on EU needs to get its house in order. I think that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if you'd share some thoughts as to how you define or what you think a house in order looks like, more specific than more defense, more security, sort of more autonomous, so to speak. And with that house in order, how would you see converging or diverging interest with the United States on major issues facing the world, irrespective of Trump or Biden? Thanks.
So, Monsieur Escour, I think you will have the privilege to conclude. Yes. Thank you. And we will have the privilege to listen to you.
It's over to you, Francois.
I thought you
Yes,
said
please.
conclusion. So,
No, you conclude.
you mean I want me to answer? No, it's not the conclusion. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Two things here. First of all, on the defense side, it really does mean at least 3% for defense. That's about, I mean, there are all sorts of studies which have been conducted over the last few years, including by the IISS in London, which I was the chairman at the time, a few years ago, on what it would cost the Europeans to make up for American assets which for some reason or another would no longer be available to NATO in Europe. And the answer came out at what in today's terms, in money terms, would be about an additional point of GDP in favor of defense beyond the 2% target. And you find the same, and you get to the same conclusion if you take it from different angles, including, of course, more recently, the ability to make up for America's absence in the war against Ukraine, which is something which we had to face during the first 4 months of this year, when for reasons which were, how to put it, I'm being polite, serendipitously American, when for 4 months there was no American armaments assistance to Ukraine anymore. So that means 1% more of GDP. Yes, we have all sorts of economic problems, who doesn't? But if Estonia can do it and if Poland can do it, I really don't see why France or the UK or Spain and so on could not do it. That's the first element, and how you manage those 3% is obviously another big issue, but we already talked about that in terms of the powers of the Commission, generating economies of scale, and so on. The second item is the incredibly difficult and intricate handling of the US, China, Europe triangle. And this is not an academic issue. This is really very practical. When you have, I mean, Europe is supposed to be very weak on high tech. I hear that every day, except that, you have a firm like ASML, which is, I think, Europe's third largest market evaluation today. Well, you have the Chinese ambassador saying to the folks at ASML, if you don't deliver this or that to us, there will be consequences for the Netherlands. And then in the evening, the American ambassador tells the same thing. How do you handle that? The answer is with difficulty. There are elements which have been put in place, and I'm going to cite a name which may sound very unusual, and that is Mike Pompeo, a Trumpian, dyed-in-the-wool Trumpian, who at the end of Trump's first term suggested that there should be an EU-US Council on Tech and Investment with China. That was actually done, followed through by the Biden administration, bless their souls, but it is functioning way below potential. And there's going to have to be a lot more of that. And how do we do that, particularly if we, notably in terms of the Green Deal, in terms of fighting climate change, which are a real priority for the Union, and one on which we all agree, if we find ourselves in a vice between the Americans who are subsidizing massively their industry in this area and the Chinese who are swamping us with their state-subsidized goods, how do we cope? And the answer is, here again, with great difficulty. So it's not setting the house in order, it's building a new house. That's why I was objecting to that formulation earlier on. We have to build a new house. It's not simply removing the dust from under the carpet.
Look, I was really privileged to moderate this chapter of the Divina Commedia and this voyage from, the realms, from high to the low and from the low to the high. I have to conclude. I think this is an anthologic panel, and I will recommend for all of you to look through it and listen and take notes. Following us will be strategic states of freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, in the same hall, with moderator from Ion Ionita, Mr. Ion Ionita, who is a chief editor of Historia, Defense Romania. I would give an applause to our panelists, and bonne continuation, as they say. Thank you.